It's Star Trek time again, and for 4 of these reviews now in a row, I tend to kick off with a sense of barely bridled enthusiasm. This time, episode 5, Spock Amok, I'm having a weird reaction. It's taken me a little longer than it has done for the previous episodes to kind of process it, to get a handle on it, to figure out how I feel about it and why I feel a certain way about it. I think I've narrowed it down. And the problem wasn't because it was a bad episode, far from it. It was well paced, it tapped a lot of harmonies, ding ding ding, and was generally very entertaining. I don't know why I felt the need to demonstrate harmonies for you when I'm quite clearly tone deaf, but unlike the other episodes so far, where I knew exactly the kinds of stuff I wanted to talk about and the comparative contrasts and parallels to classic Trek shows and episodes that I wanted to pull up as examples, this episode marks this series' first attempt at comedy. And at first I wasn't sure whether or not it was working. Hello again, I am Blunty, and I really hope something cohesive and interesting falls out of the cognitive solution that this episode of Star Trek swirled up in my meat thinker, because it took a while to precipitate out. So, last week, 100% continual tension building, taut, anxious, breath-catchingly enthralling at every turn and every moment and every beat. This week, absolute whiplash. It wasn't deep, it wasn't drama, it wasn't tense, it was just kind of goofy and small. Except when it wasn't. And more than that, it featured a very, very specific kind of goofy that very few sci-fi shows can get away with and not come across as incongruent or tonally jarring. There's no grand adventure, no looming threat. If any of the stories being told have a worst-case scenario ending, even the stakes for that are just not catastrophic. Slightly annoying for some people, but yeah. And there is a common theme throughout the entire episode, and I mean literary thematics, not the familiar musical thematics from TOS and also Cable Guy. So, Spock and his Mrs-to-be T'Pring are trying to carve out some time together between their respectively demanding careers, while simultaneously Spock is dwelling on some personal insecurities he's had for all of his life, basically. Una and La'an are thin cartoons of joyless outsiders baffled by how other people can have fun being childish, while simultaneously arrogantly looking down on them for being capable of fun at all, or having the gall to notice that these two are kind of pathologically ractically puckered. Only this week it's played for mockery instead of reflecting on traumatic childhoods of abuse and the mind-shattering horror of being hunted as food. Nurse Chapel is a similarly thin cartoon of someone with relationship commitment issues in the most boringly written, predictable Hollywood rom-com cliche way possible. Luckily, they abandoned that pretty quickly. But Jess Bush's silk-smooth charisma makes it fun instead of tedious, for the most part. So the episode rolls along a bit. Spock's whole T'Pring thing is not going as smoothly as he would have liked. Spock's mulling over his options at the bar. Chapel uses him as an excuse to dodge roll out of a conversation with generic clingy doink buddy guy, who's like, where is this relationship going? And she's like, I just want a bone. But she goes over to Spock, and we get possibly one of the cutest little moments on screen I've ever seen in Star Trek. She gives him a little clip on the head, and in his suppression of the shock, he lets a little vanity slip past and hurriedly fixes his hair. I don't know why I found that moment so amusing, so cute, so beautiful, but I did, and I love it, and I will watch it again and again and again, and I'm sure there's already GIFs of it out there for your, social media posting conveniences. Meanwhile, Pike's story is playing diplomat to an alien species who is a little tricky to understand because of a culture gap, which is just classic Trek trope stuff, nothing too interesting going on yet. But in the setup for this, I snatched onto what I'm sure the writers thought or intended to be a clever twist at the end, pretty early. The writer's mistake was having the alien chappie say the word empathy so pointedly, because it just exposed the whole plan for the little arc there. So you're supposed to think, oh, these blokes are reflective empaths. They mirror the attitude of whoever they're speaking with. They were angry at the Tellarites, whose whole thing is being grouchy and argumentative. They were standoffish with the stoic diplomats. They were friendly towards Pike, and once they spoke to the Vulcans, they were very, very, very logical. But from moment one, I'm all like, oh yeah, that's not it. I am onto you writers. The gimmick here is obviously they're showing empathy as an invitation and expecting it back in return, because if only one side is showing empathy and attempting to understand the position of the other, it's all monodirectional, then how can cooperation truly be mutual? And the whole thing is a backdrop to a diplomatic arrangement between the Federation and an alien species trying to get them to come on board with the Federation. And of course that mutual cooperation, understanding and empathy is what the Federation is for. Subtle and clever writing. So while it was fun to watch, and Mount himself is endlessly enjoyable to watch as he projects dozens of thoughts at a time with small collections of micro expressions across his face, but I was sitting there the whole time waiting for the damn characters on screen to just catch up to what my brain had already figured out. I'm like, how are you not getting this yet? Isn't this obvious? You're trained diplomats. Why can't... I felt like Chandler trying to explain something to Joey. Just get there faster. So, much like last week's submarine warfare episode, the cliches of the framing devices at play here in the various pairings of characters, the tropes and familiar banal hypertext, are not a weakness in the writing. And I saw this as a frequent criticism of last week's episode. Oh, it's just copying these other episodes. It's lazy writing, they're just copy-pasting what has worked before. Guys, you're not getting it. You're not quite understanding why tropes are tropes. Because leaning on tropes is not necessarily lazy writing. It can be, not always. They're not just copy-paste ideas, assembling a new episode from puzzle pieces of stuff we've liked in the past just to placate you as the viewer, to pander to you. No, they give us a framework that's familiar, so the actions of the characters within this framework, climbing on this framework, are the thing we can focus on because we know how the trope goes. The difference is how that character is reacting to the situation. The point is not the trope itself, the point is the character. So, this time the all too familiar sitcom-style tropes of odd ones out, or a comitophobe doling out advice they won't take themselves, and of political diplomacy standing in for interpersonal meta-commentary, are the wall on which hangs an effort to let us learn more about the characters involved. The episode, aside from being generally light-hearted and kind of predictable, for a little while it kind of lulls you into a sense of gentle, small, chuckle, chill, and then it comes out and just clips you around the ear with a goddamn body swap gimmick episode. Ta-da! Took them almost half the episode to set it up, and then it's there. Didn't see that coming. Now, the body swap is, of course, another trope. It's a rare Trek trope, though. Not unheard of. Turnabout intruder on the original series, obviously, as an example, and to a lesser extent when Bones had bits of Spock leaking through his face in the Search for Spock movie, or when the Doctor body snatched Seven of Nine for some, well, it was an episode of Voyager doing some episode of Voyager things. Not peak Trek, but kind of fun in its own way. But the point is, for this episode, empathy is the running theme. Spock and T'Pring, in an effort to do a bit of mind meld relationship counseling to literally understand one another better. My mind to your mind becomes my mind in your mind. And through some sitcom tropery hijinks, they have to live a day in one another's places and each learn a tidy little lesson on what the other's perspective actually is and how other people view them. Of course, being Vulcan, it comes with the lampshade of acknowledging that this is indeed hijinks, which I'm now wondering if Vulcans had a word for hijinks before they met humans. I don't think their pre-Federation days dealing with the Andorians or Tellarites or Klingons would have seen much need for a word like hijinks. There are very few Klingon hijinks. Andorians not notorious for their hijinks. Tellarites, maybe. But the episode got another solid laugh from me as Spock and T'Pring, upon explaining logically what happened to them to the captain, they exclaim that it should be obvious because of how different their mannerisms are. It's an obvious joke about flat affect Vulcan presentation, but I think it got me a laugh because it seemed too obvious to use, and they used the joke anyway. Stepping back from the body swap for a moment, on that point, in the opening of the show, we see Spock having an anxiety dream where his human half and his Vulcan half are two separate entities fighting it out. And again, it's a thin and overused writing trope. Sometimes it's figurative, like a dream in this case. Sometimes it's sci-fi shenanigans, like when a Vidian doctor literally separated B'Elanna's human and Klingon DNA into two entirely separate, self-sustaining physical entities to explore, you know, what makes her Klingon and what makes her human. Is it which part is the weakest, which part is overcompensating? It was a pretty good episode. And actors always love episodes like that because it gives them room to stretch. But the reason I bring it up is, within the context of a show, it paints the contrast that exists between Spock, or a Spock, who would be fully Vulcan, and his presentation and affect, and a Spock who would be fully human, doing the same. In a meta view, it shows us just what a careful line Ethan Peck, as an actor, is walking with his portrayal of this younger, more inexperienced, and more openly conflicted Spock, as a blend of those two things. All three examples, the real-world Spock and the two dream Spocks, are instantly and obviously different, but familiar at the same time, and internally consistent with what we know about all those aspects. And not just visually, as costuming and makeup and Peck's physicality portrays, but in the way he speaks, what and how he says what he says as Vulcan or human Spock, and indeed when he chooses to speak at all. The human side obviously being a lot more thinking out loud, kind of chatter, panicky stuff than the Vulcan side is, who only speaks when it's absolutely necessary to have something to say, when he has a point to make. It helps place the viewer into a perspective to see Peck's Spock not just as another actor filling a role someone else made iconic 55 years ago, of him trying to mimic or do an impersonation or impression of that Spock, but as an actor who considered the character properly, who understands who and what Spock is. Now, I had no qualms about Peck's on-screen Spock before now, outside of the spectacularly shitty writing in Discovery he was given to sludge through. But it was this gimmick in this episode that endeared his performative choices to me very solidly. I'm 100% on board with this Spock from here on in. Back within the fiction of the show, as much of a trope as the body swap, walk a mile in each other's shoes gimmick is, it was actually used quite delicately. There's some genuinely wonderful small moments that not only let Spock and T'Pring in on one another's lives and get some proper insight, but we as the audience get an insight by the contrast. And not just of the characters, but how they relate to one another and other people in ways we would never see them just say to one another on screen in conversation, because, well, they're Vulcans. And I'll be damned if they didn't make this goofy ass stupid gimmick work. It's real easy for this shtick to get super campy and just pantomime to the point of cringe. But the rope they walk between acknowledging the inherently silly construct of it all and using it for genuine character insight was remarkable. And the actors' choices are carrying a lot more weight than the writer's dialogue is in this episode. It's all about that performance, not about the dialogue. So running parallel to all this, Una and La'an are trying to empathize with, trying to figure out why the ship thinks they're made entirely out of anti-fun particles, and how risk-taking behavior under social pressures can be fun when framed as a game of dares. Again, just all kinds of predictable writing here and extremely two-dimensional stuff. Frankly, these two actors have perhaps the most dull on-screen chemistry of any pairing we've seen so far in any episode of this show. But with this too, there's an attempt to balance comedy with its use as a tool for character exploration. But this time it crumbles apart. There's a couple of funny moments, no doubt, sure, like in the elevator where they're competing to see who the computer will listen to. That's kind of fun for a moment. But none of it plays as believable for these two characters as we've known them so far and as we understand them. The writers are just, they're kind of determined to keep trying to force this, to make this boring lack of dynamic between Una and La'an work. It's not going to work. Please stop trying. It's painful to watch. These two are not Paris and Kim. They're not Odo and Quark. They're not Bones and Spock. They're not Geordi and Data. They are not Bashir and O'Brien. They're not Trip and Malcolm. They're not even the painfully forced Tilly and Michael pairing. They're Chakotay and they're Chakotay and basically any other character on Voyager. They keep trying to make it work, but sooner or later you know the writers will have to just give up on trying to force it to work because the characters just don't pair in any interesting way. The actors have zero on-screen chemistry. There's no classic dynamic of likely besties or even playful frenemies. They're just boring when played against one another. And frankly, between drawing live weapons on one another and firing them as a game, holy shit, that is genuinely horrific. I don't care if it's on the lowest phaser setting. For a Starfleet officer, this is absurd, and especially for either of these two people to point a gun at someone for shits and giggles. It's just, no. Rule 1 of projectile weapons, you always treat a gun as if it was loaded, even if you know for certain it is not. And you never point the damn things at something you are not willing to destroy. And these two are people who should know this. The first officer of a flagship and the goddamn security officer of a flagship playing with guns. There's no exception to these rules, no caveat that reads, it's okay to point guns at your friends if it's for figuring out if it's fun to shoot your mates a little bit. These are not Nerf guns. These are not water pistols. You make one mistake and you've vaporized a hole into the chest, flesh and organs of another person. And in Una's case, a person you are responsible for keeping safe. And in La'an's case, a person you are responsible for keeping safe. Have you ever seen taser training? The kind where people who are expected to use tasers have to be shot with them so they know how it feels, they know how it expects. You see the kinds of precaution and safety measures in play in those training sessions, how many people it takes, medical assistance on standby, and all that for a weapon that by design is meant to be non-lethal every time. And these two jackasses firing weapons capable of vaporizing shit, standing in a starship hall with the intent of shooting each other for a dare. Piss off! My suspension of disbelief is disintegrated like so much flesh when hit with a Klingon disruptor. And taking a walk on the hull of a ship in space, protected only by a force field, same crap. It felt wildly out of character for both of these characters as characters, and for literally anyone in Starfleet, much less those with officer training and holding the highest ranks and responsibilities in their respective positions. Even if the supposed point was to take a risk and break a rule for the sake of breaking a rule, the first officer and the security officer doing this shit, risking their lives in the radioactive vacuum of space because it might be more fun than wearing a spacesuit while you do it, all just to see if it makes them feel the human emotion of fun, no sale, not buying it. It is dipshittery of the highest order, and whoever is responsible for pitching this in the writing room, find another job. You don't understand writing. I am, however, loving the dynamic being constructed between Chapel and Spock. Now, in the original series, Nurse Chapel had a big, unrequited, horny vibe for Spock. Utterly one-sided, of course, and extremely shallowly played out, and more than frequently kind of just uncomfortable to watch on screen. It was really awkward. This, though, genuine chemistry. We see the thoughtful, insightful, and compassionate side of Nurse Chapel that in most situations, she masks over with the energetic quippiness that we've seen so far, and occasional sort of deadpan sardonic smirks, and general sort of wryness. And for Spock, she lets it drop, because she wants him to really see her. And she gets that her usual kind of chaotic good energy isn't going to work on Spock anyway. And she has enough insight and respect for the man to not even try it. Instead, she offers him her most earnest self. And the way Spock, in his own way, returns her efforts to be a good friend, to be open and earnest, and to build a closer trust and affection, not with a cold thank you and a nod of respect as many Vulcans might, and not even with a reciprocal gesture offering to afford her a sounding board or personal advice should she ever need it from him. No, he gives her something far more meaningful, with that ever so Spock maneuver of teasing sarcasm. The kind that he only ever indulges in for those he is closest to. Primarily it was Kirk and Bones in the original series, and here we see him offer it up as a gesture of affection to Nurse Chapel, and more wonderfully, she understands him well enough to get it, and what an intimate act it is for Spock to let the Vulcan facade drop enough to indulge in that. And she doesn't remark on it, she doesn't point out how unusual it is for a Vulcan to make a joke or tease someone like that. She isn't confused by the act, she isn't off-put by it, she just understands the warmth it was intended to deliver. So instead, we see her flush a little. She gets a little shy. There's a flutter of joy at knowing Spock doesn't merely respect her as a professional, as a crewmate, or as a scientific peer, but in that moment, Spock has made it clear to her that he trusts her with his friendship. And it was cute as shit. We all have our languages of love. Some use physical touch, some with eye contact, some with words, some with gestures. We all have our own way of expressing ourselves to those we trust the most. I knew someone whose language of love was relatively unusually biting, the way a playful puppy would. That's how she'd communicate affection and trust, if she'd give you a little bite and slobber on the arm. It was kind of gross but adorable at the same time because I knew what it meant. For me, I'm a bit more like Spock, or indeed T'Pol, as I dive deep on in a previous video, talking about atypical Vulcans and like them being allegories for neurodiversity, and in my case, autism. My language of love is letting the mask slip, and much like Spock, it's not rare for it to be in the form of a very particular kind of teasing. Spock has only a few friends that he knows understand him deeply and honestly enough that he will unmask for them, without the exasperating dread of rejection or confusion from others if he would do the same to people who don't quite know him that well. Spock and I are the same in that way, and we both choose very carefully who we trust that much. So it hits me clean when this Spock does something like pointing out to Chapel that he's teasing her, not by playfully mocking her idiosyncrasies, but by teasing himself, playing sarcasm against the Vulcan stereotype he is expected to conform to for the sake of others. Playful self-awareness of how he knows he is perceived by others. And in this act of bone-dry, deadpan self-deprecation, exposing it all as a facade and not the whole truth of who he really is. Make no mistake, this is not merely a gesture of friendship, of affection. It is a genuine moment of personal intimacy. It is, in every practical sense, a mind hug. Now, with 6 minutes to go in the episode, and Pike finally catches up to my big brain move at the beginning and figures out the whole, hey, empathy is actually most useful when it's a bi-directional thing, thus painting the thematics of the whole episode writ large for anyone who managed to miss it so far. The writers are very, very concerned that oh, we're being really subtle, Oh, what if people don't get how we're being subtle? We better explain it at the end for the dummies out there. I'm not appreciating that about this current Trek. If you're going to do subtle, leave it as subtle and let the fandom discuss it and unpack it. Don't wait till the last 5 minutes of the show and then explain it all to everybody. So, Pike gets some praise for his unusual but insightful style of diplomacy. The Admiral unclenches his butthole, rewarded for his faith in Pike, and I guess Uhura was there in the room. Also, let's acknowledge the green tunic. Nice touch. Not as nice as dun 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 dun, but nice all the same. Pike's little speech also offers up a more candid viewpoint of the Federation than we're used to seeing on screen. See, in most Trek, it's either idealized into a ridiculous pantomime or it's treated as mildly insidious, depending on what the plot needs from it. But this is a very rare time it's looked upon in a more pragmatic and honest way, and I really love that. It is Pike's self-awareness via the Federation. So, with Spock and T'Pring, Una and La'an, Pike and the diplomats, Spock and Chapel, all offering up sort of little perspective shifts on what empathy can do, why it's important not just to feel it for others, not just to ask them for it from them, but to actively seek it out and offer it up and make the effort for it. Empathy should never ever be passive. It should always be active, proactive. It's the only way it actually works. And it is all wrapped up in, well, as Spock puts it, hijinks, to stop it feeling too heavy or laboured or preachy, especially after the emotional nerve pinch of last week's unrelenting tensions. I've got to knock my shoulder from that one. It was a wonderful, wonderful episode of Trek. It is small Trek, but classic small Trek. You know what I mean? Thank you for watching. I am Blunty. Live long and prosper. And thank you as always to the patrons scrolling up above there, who's above and beyond support. I appreciate it very, very much. And yeah, Strange New Worlds. I continue to be impressed by it being a Star Trek show. Wonderful, isn't it?